Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications. The following interactive performance is a first-round entry in Chilling Tales for Dark Nights 2025 Evil Idol voice acting competition. And you, listener, get to help decide who advances to round 2. Voting is simple. Following the performance, simply click the thumbs up icon on this video if you'd like this contestant to move forward, or the thumbs down if you'd like to see them be eliminated. Voting on this entry will conclude 1 week after the date of its posting. Thank you, and good luck to all of our contestants.
Part 1. The storm had come down from the north without warning. A black wall of cloud that swallowed the stars and smothered the sea in darkness. Wind clawed at the cliffs with wild, shrieking hands, and the lighthouse stood against it all, a stoic, crumbling finger of stone lashed by rain and spray. Inside, Donovan Kimball slept fitfully beneath a heavy quilt, one arm flung over his eyes to block the occasional flicker of lightning that broke through the warped shutters. He had not meant to stay long when he first took the job. The ad in the paper had promised solitude and steady pay, enough, he thought, to settle his mother's debts and perhaps afford better care for Margaret, before the cancer claimed her completely. Donovan had arrived 6 months ago with 2 battered suitcases and a heart hollowed out by desperation. He had seen the old trunk in the corner of the sitting room, its iron clasps rusted shut, and heard the local councilman mumble something about records and old instructions. But there had been so much to do, repairs to living quarters, maintenance on the corroded gears, and Donovan had pushed thoughts of dusty journals and sailor superstitions aside. The lighthouse itself had an unsettling presence, even on clear days. Its walls groaned in the heat, and its iron stairs shuddered underfoot, but Donovan, a practical man by necessity, had long since learned to ignore the quirks of old structures. Tonight, however, as the gale battered the coastlines and waves smashed themselves against the rocks below, there was an edge to the place he could not explain away. At precisely 3 minutes past midnight, Donovan woke to a sound that should not have existed. Knock, knock, knock. He sat up, blinking into the darkness. For a moment he thought it had been a dream, some phantom noise stitched together by a restless mind. Then it came again, louder this time. Knock, 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 against the heavy oak door at the base of the tower. Donovan swung his legs out from under the quilt, wincing as the cold floorboards bit into his bare feet. He pulled on his boots without bothering to lace them and reached for the lantern perched on the bedside table. The flame inside shivered and leaned with every gust that pressed against the walls. The spiral staircase moaned under his weight as he descended, the lantern casting a swinging circle of light ahead of him. Shadows bled from the corners where the stonework met the wooden supports, and the air smelled faintly of salt and old smoke. Donovan tightened his grip on the lantern handle and muttered a curse under his breath. At the bottom of the stairs he paused, listening. The storm roared around the lighthouse, but beneath it, he thought he heard something else. The faint, persisting tapping against the door. Not frantic, not desperate, merely insistent, as if whatever waited outside had infinite patience. He crossed the room, his boots thudding against the uneven floor, and laid his free hand on the iron latch. For a moment he hesitated, the old instincts of a dock worker stirring in his mind. Never open a door at night, especially not during a storm. But reason quickly overruled superstition. If it was a sailor in distress or some poor soul washed ashore, Donovan could not in good conscience leave him to die. He lifted the latch and pulled the door open against the howling wind. The beam from his lantern pierced the darkness, illuminating a scene of pure desolation. Rain slashed sideways across the threshold. The rocky path leading down to the beach was slick with runoff, and beyond it, the sea seethed. No figure stood on the doorstep. No shadow moved along the path. Donovan stepped outside for a moment, raising the lantern higher. Its light revealed nothing but stones and crashing surf. No footprints marked the mud at his feet. No voice called out from the blackness. Frowning, he retreated inside and closed the door firmly, sliding the iron bolt back into place with a dull scrape. He stood there for a moment longer, listening to the wind scream against the stone and wood before finally turning away. Perhaps it had been nothing. Perhaps the storm had loosened a shutter somewhere or thrown a piece of debris against the door. The old mind, burdened by worry and lack of sleep, often heard what it expected to hear. Still, as Donovan climbed back up the stairs to his small, cold bed, he could not shake the feeling that something unseen had been waiting just beyond the reach of the lantern's glow. Something that knew he had opened the door. Something that had been invited in. Part 2. Sleep did not come easily after Donovan climbed back under the quilt. The storm battered the lighthouse with relentless fury, rattling the windows in their frames and sending occasional shudders through the stone walls. He lay with his eyes closed, the sound of the wind rising and falling in waves, but rest remained elusive. Every time he drifted towards unconsciousness, he thought he heard the faint memory of that knock, ghosting through the whine of the storm. He told himself it was nerves, nothing more. The mind could weave strange illusions when pressed by exhaustion and isolation. The lighthouse had always been an eerie place, perched on the edge of the world like a long-forgotten sentinel. He had known that when he accepted the posting. Still, when the second knock came, there was no mistaking it. Knock, knock, knock. It was no longer a request for shelter. It was a summons. This time, the sound carried a weight that the first had not. It rang sharply through the tower's hollow spaces like a bell. Donovan sat bolt upright and swung his legs to the floor again, pulling his boots on with shaking hands. The lantern sat cold and dark on the bedside table. In his hurry, he had forgotten to refill it earlier. Cursing under his breath, he grabbed the matches and coaxed the flame back to life, shielding it carefully from the gusts leaking through the warped window panes. The staircase seemed longer on the second ascent. The shadows felt thicker and more aggressive, creeping up the walls and coiling in the corners. Donovan kept his eyes fixed ahead, unwilling to glance over his shoulder, though every instinct in him screamed that something followed just beyond the reach of the light. At the base of the stairs, he hesitated. The door stood before him, the solid oak boards slick with moisture, trembling slightly on their hinges as the storm beat against it. For several long moments, Donovan remained frozen, weighing his options. Ignoring the knock was tempting, locking the bolt and retreating upstairs until daylight. However, another sound reached him then, softer but infinitely more troubling. A whimper. It was faint, nearly swallowed by the howl of the wind, but it came again, unmistakably, a high, thin cry of distress, like that of a wounded animal or a child. Grinding his teeth against a surge of unease, Donovan drew back the latch and hauled the door open. At first he saw nothing but the rain. It battered the threshold in thick sheets, turning the worn stone slick and treacherous. His lantern's flickering beam revealed no figure standing in the deluge, no shape moved beyond the reach of the light. But when he lowered his gaze, he found it. A bundle lay on the doorstep, wrapped tightly in a sheet of oilskin and bound with what looked like fishing twine. It was no larger than a sack of flour, but it shifted slightly as he watched, shuddering in a way that spoke of something alive, or at least once alive, within. The smell struck him next, salt and rot, like the shoreline after a red tide. Donovan fought the urge to recoil. Every rational thought in his mind screamed for him to leave it where it lay, to close the door, bolt it shut, and let the sea reclaim whatever horror it had coughed up onto his doorstep. But the whimper came again, this time clearly emanating from the bundle itself. Cursing under his breath, Donovan stepped forward. He crouched low, careful not to let the lantern's flame be extinguished by the gusting rain, and reached for the parcel. The oilskin was soaked through and slimy under his fingers. The bundle squirmed weakly as he lifted it, issuing a sound somewhere between a sob and a gurgle. The weight surprised him. It was heavier than it looked, dense and oddly warm despite the chill. With the bundle cradled awkwardly in one arm and the lantern in the other, Donovan staggered back inside. He kicked the door shut behind him and threw the bolt, its solid click providing only a hollow comfort. Standing in the center of the sitting room, water pooling around his boots, Donovan looked down at the shivering mass in his arms. His gut twisted painfully, torn between dread and an almost paternal instinct to protect. He set the bundle gently on the scarred kitchen table. It writhed weakly against the bindings, emitting a pitiful keening sound that raised the hair on the back of his neck. For a long moment, Donovan simply stood there, watching it. The storm raged outside, pounding against the stone walls as if demanding entrance. Inside, the only sound was the soft, labored breathing of the thing wrapped in oilskin. He would unwrap it. He would find out what the sea had delivered to his door. But he would not be able to pretend he did not know, deep down, that nothing good ever came knocking in the heart of a storm. Part 3. The knife sat on a hook above the kitchen counter, its wooden handle worn smooth by years of use. Donovan retrieved it with steady hands, though his stomach churned with unease. The bundle on the table twitched faintly, as though responding to his movements. Its oilskin wrapping had begun to loosen at the edges, leaking brackish water across the wood. Donovan approached the table, lantern in hand. He set the light down carefully, angling it to cast the widest glow. Restless shadows pooled beyond the edges of the room. Outside, the storm battered the lighthouse with renewed fury, but inside, the only sounds were the drip of water onto the floorboards and the labored breathing from within the bundle. He pressed the tip of the knife to the oilskin, hesitating. There was still time to reconsider, to bundle the thing back into the storm and let the sea reclaim whatever it had offered. Yet some stubborn instinct drove him forward, a duty to know, to confront the unknown rather than flee from it. With a conscious motion, Donovan sliced through the bindings. The twine snapped under the blade and the oilskin parted with a wet sigh. He peeled it back layer by layer, revealing the thing hidden within. At first he thought it was a child. The shape was right, small limbs curled in on themselves, a head too large for the spindly body. But as he leaned closer, the details grew wrong. The skin was translucent, stretched thin over delicate bones and networks of faintly pulsing veins. Dark, lidless eyes stared up at him, glassy and unblinking, reflecting the lantern light in wide, endless pools. Gills flared and fluttered along the sides of its neck, gasping for breath in the salty air. The creature shuddered weakly, emitting a sound halfway between a sigh and a sob. Donovan recoiled a step before catching himself. His first instinct, raw and primal, screamed at him to destroy the thing, to expel it from his home before it brought ruin down upon him. He tightened his grip on the knife, the handle slick against his palm. Yet the creature made no move to harm him. It lay helpless on the table, shivering, its thin chest rising and falling with shallow, ragged breaths. It was suffering. Whatever it was alive, and it was suffering. An image rose unbidden in Donovan's mind. Margaret, frail and sunken into the narrow hospital bed, her hand trembling in his when she had last spoken. "Do not turn away from those who need you," she had whispered, "even when you are afraid." Donovan cursed softly under his breath and set the knife down. He could not kill it. Whatever instincts cried out against the thing's presence, whatever dark memories stirred at the edges of his mind, he would not stand by and let it die. He retrieved a woolen blanket from the cupboard and wrapped the creature carefully. Its skin felt clammy and oddly slick beneath his fingers, like something half-formed, but it did not resist. It only whimpered once, a pitiful, broken sound that made his throat tighten. He placed the wrapped creature near the iron stove, adjusting the vents to coax out more heat. The flames inside guttered but then flared brighter, casting warm light across the room. The creature curled tighter into the blanket, visibly relaxing under the rising warmth. Donovan watched it for a long moment, tension slowly bleeding from his shoulders. As he stood there, the edge of his gaze caught something carved into the floorboards near the base of the stove. He knelt, brushing aside dust and grime with the edge of his sleeve, revealing a series of faint symbols, spirals interlocked with jagged lines, forming a sigil he did not recognize. The marks had been worn almost smooth by years of footsteps, but they remained faintly visible, an old forgotten protection perhaps. He straightened slowly, unease blooming anew in his chest. The journals, the trunk he had ignored. Donovan glanced towards the sitting room, where the battered trunk lay slumped against the wall, its iron clasps still rusted shut. He had dismissed it when he arrived, too focused on survival to bother with superstition and sailors' tales. Now in the flickering light of the stove, he wondered what warnings he might have missed. The creature stirred again, drawing his attention back to the present. Its black eyes fixed on him, impossibly deep, holding a flicker of something that felt too knowing to belong to a beast. Donovan found himself unable to look away, trapped in that unblinking gaze. He tore his eyes free and stepped back, shaking his head. His mind was playing tricks on him. It had to be. Exhaustion, stress, and isolation were powerful forces. He would tend to the creature tonight and keep it alive if he could. In the morning, he would hike to town and send a message to the mainland. Let someone wiser and better equipped deal with whatever the storm had delivered to his doorstep. For now, the lighthouse stood firm against the raging dark, its beam slicing across the seething sea. And Donovan Kimball stood watch, unaware that the door he had opened would never again be closed. Part 4. The storm did not lessen as the night dragged on. If anything, it deepened, pressing against the lighthouse walls with a force that seemed almost personal. Rain battered the windows in frantic bursts, and the tower groaned under the constant assault of the wind. Donovan sat in the kitchen with the bundle still nestled near the stove, but his gaze kept drifting towards the battered trunk resting against the far wall. He had spent the past hour tending to the creature, drying its clammy skin with a threadbare towel, and coaxing weak sips of water past its thin lips. Each act of kindness unsettled him further, gnawing at the foundation of his instincts. The creature's black eyes never closed, never blinked. They followed his every movement with a quiet, unsettling intensity. At last, when he could bear the weight of that stare no longer, Donovan rose and crossed the room to the trunk. The iron clasps had rusted shut, but a few sharp blows from the handle of the knife were enough to jar them loose. The lid creaked open, releasing a puff of musty air thick with the scent of salt, mildew, and old paper. Donovan coughed and waved the cloud aside, squinting into the gloom. Inside, a tangle of leather-bound journals, brittle maps, and small, unfamiliar relics lay scattered. Atop the pile rested a ledger, its cover cracked and curling at the edges. Donovan lifted it free, brushing off a film of dust. The first page bore the names of the lighthouse's previous keepers, each one followed by dates, sometimes spanning decades, sometimes only a few months. Beside some entries, crude notes had been scrawled. Lost to the sea, taken in the storm, Service completed. Donovan flipped through the ledger, the pages growing more chaotic as he progressed. Early entries detailed maintenance schedules and supply orders. Later ones darkened, filled with terse, hurried handwriting that spoke of sleepless nights and mounting dread. One entry, penned in a spidery hand, nearly illegible with haste, caught his eye. The barrier weakens. Each generation swears the oath anew, lest the children find a way ashore. Keep the light burning, perform the offerings, renew the wards. Without vigilance, the sea will claim what we stole. The sea never forgot, and neither did what slept beneath it. Donovan's mouth went dry. He set the ledger aside and pulled another volume from the trunk, this one smaller and bound in stained, water-warped leather. Inside, sketches depicted symbols eerily similar to those carved into the floor near the stove. Spirals and jagged lines intertwined with crude depictions of figures kneeling before the sea, offering strange bundles wrapped in cloth. Beneath one illustration, a single word had been etched in forceful strokes. Pact. Donovan dropped the journal onto the floorboards, recoiling as if burned. The lighthouse had never been simply a beacon for sailors. It had been a bulwark, a seal against something older and darker than the sea itself. Every keeper before him had known, and had agreed to participate in the maintenance of that barrier. Sacrifices had been made, rituals performed, secrets kept. No one had told Donovan when he signed the employment contract. No mention had been made of blood debts or ancient promises. He had inherited the responsibility unknowingly, through desperation and ignorance. He turned back towards the kitchen. The creature remained by the stove, bundled tightly, breathing in shallow gasps. The fire danced across its translucent skin, illuminating faint tracings of veins that throbbed with each fragile heartbeat. It looked vulnerable, almost pitiful, yet Donovan could no longer ignore the truth. By opening the door and taking the bundle inside, he had broken whatever fragile protection remained. Donovan rubbed a hand across his face, feeling the weight of exhaustion and fear settle deeper into his bones. His thoughts churned, each revelation dragging him further from the solid ground of reason and into a churning sea of uncertainty. A low, hollow sound drew his attention. At first he thought it was the storm again, another howl of wind surging against the tower. But as he listened, he realized it came from beneath the floor, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated the stones. He knelt quickly, pressing his ear against the cold boards. The hum resolved itself into voices, distant and murmuring, as though an unseen congregation gathered beneath the lighthouse foundation. He could not make out the words, but the cadence chilled him. It was a chant, ancient and slow, rising and falling with a rhythm that felt both alien and sickeningly familiar. Donovan scrambled to his feet. The lantern flickered violently on the table. Shadows twisted across the walls, warping into grotesque shapes that vanished when he looked at them directly. The storm outside no longer seemed natural. It was something else now, a living, seething entity pressing in against the thin walls of the lighthouse, demanding access. Donovan staggered back towards the trunk, frantically searching the pile. His hands closed around a stone, black, smooth, and faintly warm to the touch. Strange sigils had been etched into its surface, though the language was unfamiliar. The relics of those who had fought this battle before him lay at his feet, abandoned by men who had either fled or failed. He glanced back at the creature still curled near the stove and felt a surge of helpless rage. This had never been a job, it had been a sentence, and by taking the keys and lighting the lamp 6 months ago, Donovan Kimball had unknowingly chained himself to a war that no man could win. Part 5. The first crack appeared in the lantern's glass. Donovan watched in helpless horror as the flame inside guttered and died, leaving the kitchen steeped in a suffocating gloom. The shadows, once restrained to the corners of the room, swelled outward, coating the walls and ceiling in darkness, their every movement synchronized with the distant chanting beneath the floor. He stumbled back and braced himself against the table. His hands, slick with sweat, slipped across the wood before he found his footing. He reached for the second lantern kept on the shelf by the stairs, fumbling with the matches. It took several tries before the flame caught, sputtering weakly to life. The new light revealed that the creature had shifted. It no longer lay huddled in its blanket, but had risen onto thin, trembling limbs. Its black, glassy eyes locked into Donovan with a gaze that froze him where he stood. No helpless whimper passed its lips now. Instead, it tilted its head at an unnatural angle, regarding him with a patience that felt ancient and calculating. A new sound filtered through the battered walls, a low, dragging scrape along the outer stones of the lighthouse. Donovan turned toward the nearest window and peered into the storm. Figures pressed against the glass. At first he could not distinguish them from the rain and mist, but as lightning split the sky, their forms sharpened into terrible clarity. Dozens of figures swayed outside the tower, clad in the tattered remnants of sailors' garb. Faces bloated and warped by the sea peered inward with hollow, accusing eyes. Barnacles clung to their rotted flesh, and seaweed streamed from their mouths like grotesque tongues. The Washers had arrived. The light atop the tower, the very heart of the lighthouse, flickered visibly through the storm, its steady pulse faltering like a dying heartbeat. Donovan knew instinctively that once that beam failed, there would be nothing left to hold the darkness at bay. The walls would crumble, the foundation would fail. The storm would not merely destroy the lighthouse, but would sweep beyond it, carrying its terrible cargo inland. He faced the creature again, his mind racing. Somewhere deep inside, the truth solidified. The creature was no innocent victim. It was the key, the wedge that had been placed within the lighthouse to crack its defenses. By allowing it entry, Donovan had sealed the tower's fate. Yet, perhaps if he acted swiftly enough, he could undo the damage. Perhaps the sea would take back its child, and the breach could be repaired before the final collapse. He grabbed the blanket, scooping the creature up in one motion. It did not resist. It merely watched him with unblinking eyes, as if it had known all along what must come. Its skin, cold and clammy against his arms, sent a deep shiver through him. Donovan kicked the door open with his boot, bracing himself against the howling wind that tore at his coat and lashed at his face with icy needles of rain. He staggered onto the slick path, clutching the bundled creature tightly against his chest. The Watchers turned as one. Their eyeless faces lifted toward him, and a chorus of low, mournful cries rose above the storm's roar. Some began to move, their rotted limbs dragging across the ground as they lurched towards him with dreadful purpose. Donovan forced his legs to move, slipping and stumbling along the broken stones that led to the cliff's edge. The path, already treacherous in calm weather, had become a death trap in the storm. He fell once, his knee striking the sharp edge of a rock, but he ignored the burst of pain and staggered back to his feet. The cliff loomed ahead, its jagged edge obscured by the curtain of rain. Beyond it, the sea boiled and heaved, frothing with unnatural violence. Waves the size of houses battered the rocks below, sending spray high into the air. Donovan reached the precipice and held the creature out over the abyss. For a moment he hesitated. The creature stared up at him, its expression serene. A flash of memory seared across his mind. Margaret's frail hand in his, her whispered plea never to abandon those in need. He tightened his grip on the blanket, steeling his heart against the surge of doubt. With a hoarse cry, he hurled the bundle into the churning sea. The creature vanished into the darkness below without a sound. For a breathless moment, the world stood still. The light atop the tower flared suddenly, burning with a fierce, desperate brilliance. The Watchers recoiled, shrieking, their forms dissolving into mist that the wind carried out over the water. The chanting beneath the lighthouse ceased, cut off as though a blade had severed it. Donovan staggered back from the cliff, chest heaving, blood pounding in his ears. He had done it. He had acted. He had chosen. But in the hollow between the heartbeats, Donovan felt no true relief, only a terrible echoing silence from the deep. Part 6. Donovan stumbled backwards from the cliff's edge, his breath tearing in and out of his lungs with a desperate force. The wind, still vicious, seemed somehow less charged now, stripped of the malevolent intelligence that had pressed against the lighthouse walls. Overhead, the clouds churned and cracked apart, revealing thin slashes of pale, reluctant stars. The beam of the lighthouse burned with renewed strength, slicing cleanly through the night in long, unwavering sweeps. The great lens atop the tower spun in its housing, casting its protective gaze far out over the dark, heaving waters. Donovan recoiled at the sight. Against all odds, the light still stood. He had preserved it. He turned his gaze back to the sea. The watchers had receded, their bloated, tattered forms dissolved into the mist, leaving behind only shredded remnants of clothing and a few swirling eddies of foam along the rocks. The voices that had murmured beneath the lighthouse, the ancient chant that had gnawed at his sanity, had fallen silent. For the first time that night, the oppressive weight that had hung over the world seemed to lift, and Donovan allowed himself to believe that he had averted disaster. A cold rain continued to fall, but without the same ferocity. It pattered against the stones with a natural cadence rather than the earlier frenzy. The wind, though still sharp, no longer howled with that strange human edge. The world, battered and broken, had endured. Donovan pressed a hand against his aching ribs, feeling the deep bruises from his fall along the path. Pain radiated through his side and down his leg, but he welcomed it. Pain meant survival. Pain meant that he had still had a body to feel anything at all. With stiff movements, he began the slow, laborious climb back toward the lighthouse. The path was treacherous underfoot, slick with mud and rain, but Donovan no longer cared. Each step, though grueling, brought him closer to the battered tower, to shelter, to safety, to the familiar warmth of the stove and the comforting solidity of stone walls between himself and the raging world beyond. He reached the lighthouse door and braced himself against the frame, drawing in slow breaths in an attempt to steady his shaking hands. His heart raced, but a deeper, quieter part of him had begun to hope. Margaret's voice echoed faintly in his memory, full of pride and relief. "You did what you had to do. You stood your ground." Donovan smiled grimly and pushed open the door. Inside, the kitchen remained much as he had left it. The second lantern still flickered atop the table, casting long, slow-moving shadows across the worn floorboards. The stove crackled softly, emitting waves of heat that chased away the damp chill. For a few blessed moments, it was easy to believe that the nightmare had passed, that normalcy, whatever remained of it, might be restored. Yet something gnawed at the edges of his awareness. Donovan paused on the threshold, frowning. The air inside the lighthouse felt heavier than it should have, despite the retreat of the storm. A faint, unpleasant odor clung to the walls, not the sharp tang of sea salt or smoke, but something deeper, more primal. It reminded him of earth turned over in a graveyard after a torrential rain, of rot awakened by disruption. He closed the door carefully behind him and dropped the iron bolt into place. The lighthouse creaked and settled around him, the ancient stones flexing under the weight of the wind. Donovan crossed to the trunk once more, intending to retrieve another warding relic, to reinforce whatever fragile defenses he could muster before morning. As he knelt searching through the jumbled contents, another flicker of unease gripped him. The ground beneath his boots vibrated, almost imperceptibly, a low, pulsing tremor that grew stronger with each passing second. Donovan rose slowly and crossed to the nearest window, peering out into the darkness beyond. Far below, along the rocky shore where the creature had fallen, the sea no longer churned aimlessly. A great shadow moved beneath the surface, larger than any ship. The ocean, vast and uncaring, bore something toward the land. A new storm gathered on the horizon, blacker and more sinister than the last. Donovan swallowed hard, dread hollowing out his chest. The battle he had fought was not the war. It had only been the beginning. Part 7. Donovan stood frozen at the window, unable to tear his gaze from the black shape that churned beneath the surface of the sea. It was vast and ancient, beyond comprehension, and it moved with a terrible grace, the way a continent might shift unseen in the depths, dragging the tides in its wake. Even from this distance he could feel it. The newly gathered storm roiled above it, tendrils of cloud reaching down like groping fingers. Lightning flickered within the churning mass, illuminating glimpses of impossible shapes that writhed and twisted, things with too many limbs and eyes that swallowed the light. The ocean, once wild and reckless, now moved with the order of something summoned, obedient to a will older than the land itself. Donovan backed away from the window, legs trembling beneath him. The journals had warned him, he realized too late. They had whispered in brittle, fading ink, "Once a child of the storm crosses your threshold, the old bonds are broken." By taking the bundle inside, he had not merely endangered the lighthouse. He had cracked the foundation that held the ancient pact in place. His desperate act of mercy, however noble, had been exactly what the sea had waited for. The creature had not been a survivor or a refugee. It had been the key. The lighthouse beam, though still spinning, no longer pierced the darkness as it once had. Its light struck the storm and dissolved into it, swallowed without reflection or resistance. The beacon, like a voice shouting into a void too deep to answer, grew fainter with every sweep. Far beyond the cliff's edge along the ruined shoreline, Donovan could see new shapes rising from the surf, forms that moved upright but slithered and twisted in ways no human body could endure. Limbs ended in finned stumps, faces stretched into slack amphibian sneers. They poured out from the sea in numbers too great to count. The watchers had only been the first. A low vibration rattled the stones underfoot, spreading outward in widening circles. It carried with it a sound, deep and resonant, that vibrated in Donovan's teeth and bones. It was not a voice, yet it spoke all the same. A language made of gravity and inevitability, too old for human minds to name. He stumbled toward the kitchen table, clutching at it for support. The second lantern still burned there, its tiny flame struggling against the gloom. It sputtered as if the very air sought to smother the light and flared weakly before finally steadying. Donovan sagged into the chair nearest the stove, his arms hanging limp at his sides. He knew now that no message would reach the mainland in time. No ship would brave the waves boiling beyond the cliffs. No townsperson would wake before the sky fell. His thoughts splintered into fragments. Margaret's frail smile in her hospital bed, the warmth of the woolen blanket wrapped around the creature, the steady ticking of the lighthouse gears in better days. All of it would be swept away. The towns and cities inland, still sleeping under calm, starless skies, would never know the reason why their world ended in silence and flood. Outside, the sea rose higher, and in the deep places, the first true children stirred. The storm began to sing, a deep, endless note that wound itself around the bones of the world. Donovan closed his eyes and bowed his head. The children of the storm had come home at last. And behind them, something older, something hungrier, reached for the world that had forgotten its name.
Thank you for listening. I'm your host, Steve Taylor, reminding you that if you haven't already, don't forget to cast your vote for this contestant via either a thumbs up or a thumbs down vote. New entries will be posted throughout this month. Be sure to tune in and vote for each of them and help decide who becomes the next evil idol. Until next time, turn off the lights and turn on the dark.
Chilling tales for dark nights.